So, dear Marsha, thanks very much being invited. Dr. Mitsumori, same to you. Thank you for, I feel deeply privileged and honored in this prestigious hall in the university to give a talk. Marsha had already, I have also some conflicts of interest. I get a little bit of money off the German Research Foundation and do DBT trainings. This is where I live and where I work. This is Germany, and this is Heidelberg. This is in the south of Germany. And we are running there. The Central Institute is a huge institute. We have all in all about 350 beds, inpatient treatment beds. And I have a small unit with 48 residential treatment places only for borderline patients. So we treat about 50 patients in time. This means 100 or 200 patients a year on residential, and also about 150 on an outpatient level. So we have 350 treated patients per year, and we see for diagnostics about 500. We are deeply privileged on that, since in Germany we have this kind of insurance system that when you have really evidence-based data that a residential treatment works, the insurance companies pay for that. So we can have some sort of an elective treatment. We have them for 3 months, and with data show that within 3 months we get more or less exactly the same data as you get with DBT at an outpatient level within a year. And for research purposes, it's an extreme advantage, and we can taper them off medication. And if you want to do neurobiology, especially psychophysiology and so on, it doesn't make that much sense to use medicated patients. On the other hand, if you do select non-medicated patients, let's say in the States, you always have a minority of patients who are not that severely ill. So you have always this problem. So we are in this nice position that we could start with severely ill, non-medicated patients and do neurobiology. So we are also happy to run what we call, it's a big center grant, clinical research unit, mainly focusing on mechanisms of disturbed emotion processing in borderlines. This is about $15 million grant. Only focusing on borderlines. This is the second highest funding for psychiatry at all in Germany. And I just tell it that since all this success started exactly here. It's the 8th, and it's 20 years ago. When I started my career, small career, it was my first year residential training as a psychiatrist, and patient showed up at the unit, and I tried some kind of diagnostics, and after a while I didn't know what really was up with her, and then my senior psychiatrist said, "This is a borderline patient, you cannot treat her, organize the discharge." And I said, "Oh, you sure?" "I'm not sure. She has attempted suicide, and I'm not sure whether," so it doesn't matter, we don't have any treatment at all, so you get focused on depression, get focused on schizophrenia, get rid of her. And I had to organize the discharge. It was my first year, and she attempted a severe suicide. She survived. However, it was a bad start in life, and I felt guilty. And I thought, this is not the way I want to work in psychiatry. And so those times I had already learned how to read papers, since I was initially trained as a scientist. I've been done 3 or 4 years in immunology, so I was trained as a scientist. And I started to read and found Marshall's paper in the archives, and there was treatment for borderlines. And then I called in Seattle, and actually it was a miracle. I had Marshall personally on the phone. And I said, "I'm somebody, when is the next workshop?" She said, "Oh, actually it's full. You have to wait for 2 years or something like that. Or do you do research?" And I hadn't done psychiatric research, and it was not my plan. I decided to become a clinician. And then I said, "Of course I do research." "For sure." And then he said, "Then come over, we need somebody who's doing research on DBT." So that was when it all began. And I came here, did the 10 days intensive. I got back. I had a stopover in New York and learned the residential treatment developed by Charlie Svensson under the supervision of Marsha. I took this pre-treatment program to Germany, and I I set up a small unit, and then it started to work and grow and grow. And the point was that I thought, okay, I would like to use my, let's say, a little bit scientific skills just to check whether Marsha's clinical experience, what she developed the treatment for, she based the whole treatment on her clinical or personal experience, and there was simply no data on that. The idea that that's a disorder of emotion dysregulation, now everybody buys in. Those times, it was a revolution. Nobody thought it. It was Kernberg's time when he said this object fragmentation stuff and so on. And you hardly can spell it. And I said, okay, let's look for that. Let's go for testing whether Marsha is right, and first on a phenomenological level, and then under experimental conditions. And then next step was let's go for the neurobiology and look whether we find something, and maybe we can use those findings to improve DBT. And this is what I'm going to tell you is the story how it worked. Just a few sentences or one sentence to those of you who are not that familiar with this disorder. It's borderline personality disorder has a lifetime prevalence of about 3%. So this is about the triple or the quadruple schizophrenic patients. And it has been overseen for years, and the whole psychiatry was always focused on psychotics. And so on, it's important, but it completely oversaw that there was a huge demanding population. And borderline patients are expensive. In Germany, they cost us $4 billion a year, or euro. This is about 15% of the total cost for psychiatry. And so the next thing you will learn now a lot of, let's say in the next half hour, I will tell you about some neurobiological alterations, some specific cognition, some specific emotional regulation things. This all makes sense from a perspective if you consider the situation where those people grow up. And what the next sentence I say is important to say this doesn't fit for all of the families, but all of the small, let's say for a larger group. Here we investigated 260 patients, you see here, and about 60% of them told us that they've been sexually abused. About 40% experienced severe physical abuse, and about the same amount witnessed violence between parents. So this means all in all you have about 60% who really are experiencing severe interpersonal violence. This means only 70%, this means 25% not. And don't blame the parents. So the point is you can develop borderline personality disorder growing up in a nice, caring family. You have to have a background. But the majority of those patients grows up in an unpredictable, most of the time severely violent environment, and they have to develop strategies to survive, both on a physiological and on an emotional level. And the whole story of borderline growing up is a story of survival and building up strategies, and this has impact on the brain, and this is what we're going to study. So currently, from what the research says, we have 3 domains in borderline. We see emotion dysregulation as the core feature, and this has strong impact on self-concept, on social interaction, and backwards. So this is currently what people buy in. Marsha's statement in the 80s was that most dysfunctional behavioral patterns in BPD can be explained as either consequences or coping strategies of a pervasive disorder of emotion dysregulation. This is what she said. And we said, okay, let's study that. So the first thing we did is we used ambulatory assessments. Since if you want to test phenomenology, it's always better you catch the data or collect the data under daily conditions. Those times we had these fancy big hand computers. They were about this size. And we could program them, and those hand computer beeped every half hour or every hour and asked what emotion are you currently feeling and how strong is it. And we thought, okay, we find 1 or 2 emotions which are special for borderlines. But what you see here is these are the healthies, that's the healthies, this is the borderlines. And it's the entire field of emotion, whether it's anxiety, angry, sadness, shame, disgust, or anything else. So it's non-specific. That was the very first thing. There were those times tons of theories. Kernberg's always had a theory on aggression. Others had theory on anxiety. Others had theory on shame. Marshall was the first who said, no, it's a disorder of the entire emotional system. But how to study the entire emotional system, you have to focus, let's see, we want to have a core symptom. What is common to all emotions? And we came up with the idea, most of the things, it was, of course, back and forth with patients. Patients told us that very characteristic and very specific is the experience of sudden and intense aversive arousal. That is experience as being extremely distressing and can hardly be assigned to a specific emotion. This means borderline patients feel just an extreme tension and they don't know whether it's anxiety, shame, something like that. It's just, not to survive. So then we asked this question, and what we did is here, the first thing is we learned patients to monitor, and we came up with this scale and said, okay, we can scale, you can monitor your level of arousal from 0 to 9, and 7 is something like a level where your brain is completely focusing on this has to stop immediately. Yeah, I cannot stand this any longer. And you see the average level of the aversive arousal in borderline patients and on healthy controls, and you see that there's almost zero overlap. You almost never see this in other psychological phenomena. So the question that whether this is really a dimensional problem or a categorical problem has, if you look at that data, at least to be reconsidered. Then, if you go for an individual level and you investigate normal healthy population, you see these boring levels of tension. So they come up maybe at one or two levels, and this is a typical profile of a borderline patient. So see, let's start with, for an example, with this one, waking up in the morning at 9 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, she's extremely high level of arousal. Then it takes her whole afternoon to organize her down. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And you see, if you have, let's say, 4, 6, 7 hours on this level of arousal, then you are extremely sensitive for any kind of cues. So this may be a phone call, or your therapist comes late, or your mother is looking the wrong way. And then all of a sudden, the whole system shuts up again. And then the brain, this is important, on that level is completely different working than on that level. And this is true for cognitive and for memory organizing. And in this situation, your brain fires and say, do something against this, do something against this. And you're memorizing 1 or 2 solutions. And cutting is a very good solution. And so here she cut herself. This is why there's a missing. And then she starts again. So this is a typical borderline profile. And we were interested in this level here. What happens here with the brain? Uli Ebner, a good close friend of mine, came over to Seattle here, and he started to do some complicated mathematical algorithms on affective instability. And what you see here, this is just published now in the Abnormals last year. You see profiles, and these profiles show you red is high emotions, or high aversive emotions. Green is smooth. And you see exactly, this is healthy controls, these are borderlines. You see where the healthies begin and where the borderlines start. So you have here one healthy borderline type, and the others are fragmented. So the point is, affective instability is visible and completely clear. Then the next step is we went for experimental conditions. We developed what we call the Mannheim multi-component stress test. This is a really hard stress test. We ask patients for they have to learn to calculate stuff. And then whenever they get better with this calculation, the algorithm gets harder, so they never succeed. And the second thing is, then if they try to work on, and then somebody goes in and say, are you sure that you're doing your best? It's a little, you're wasting our time, yeah, and so on. A patient sit there and say, oh my gosh, yeah, and then beyond these mathematical algorithms, we show them movies with amputation and worms, and so we want to induce disgust. Since disgust is a long, ongoing aversive emotion, and the money they are promised, it gets lower and lower and lower the worse they are, so people don't like it. The good thing on that is that you can easily clearly calculate it, and so what you see here is the proof of Marshall's concept. Here, these are the healthies, the blue ones, and they get exactly the same amount of distress, and the red ones are the borderlines. So you see on the same amount of distress, they got the amplitude is much higher, and then what is even more important, if you stop your distress system, normally patients, healthies have a quick response to baseline, borderlines stay up. So this is what Marshall said, it's high intensity, high amplitudes, and low return to baseline. From the patient's perspective, it's a little bit like this. They have the feeling they're riding a wild Arab horse compared to the Clydesdale horses, this is the brewery horses, by healthy people. And this is a nice phrase you can tell patients to listen. You're riding an Arab horse, which is your emotional system. You can have a lot of fun. However, you can have a lot of troubles. You have to learn how to ride it. And how to ride an Arab horse you should have to learn skills. So, first step, we think we were able to really operationalize and make clear that Marshall's idea that emotion dysregulation is at the core is right. We were able to develop some designs for experimental inducing it, and so we were ready to look for the neurobiology. If it comes to neurobiology, we always have first to look at the limbic systems, and if you want to tell anything about the limbic system, first you have to admire its beauty. This is the limbic system. This is the famous amygdala here. And this is the hippocampus, and here's the thalamic area. So this is amygdala. And you see, this is the olfactorius. So this is from our old times as animals, the olfactorius, which gives you the smells, directly has impact on the amygdala and is extremely activating your emotional system. And so the amygdala are more or less the very first front area where all the emotional inputs get in. And whenever there's some emotional relevant, then they are activated. Then, of course, amygdala are under control. There's an intra-amygdalar control system. There's a bottom-up control system. But the most important control system, as we think, since we have the best opportunity to visualize it, is the frontolimbic circuit. And we have two circuits. The first is here located in the cingulate, and then the second is in the frontal areas. And those both circuits are like brakes inhibiting the amygdala activation. So, and that is important since a lot of research is now focusing. No? Amygdala is activated, the frontal areas are putting the brakes on it, and you need connectivity to, let's say, like a brake line. The first thing we did was looking on structures, and meanwhile there are tons of studies out which makes crystal clear that the amygdala in borderline patients are smaller than usual. The last paper we published, Inga Niedfeld from our group published in 1914, and is a meta-analysis on all structural findings, so it's generally agreed the amygdala are smaller. And if you go for functional MRI, usually you do it the way that you lay somebody in the scanner, you show them emotional pictures or emotional movies or emotional stories, whenever some kind of a social emotional cue, and you look at the activation of the amygdala. And you see here, the gray ones are borderline patients, these are healthies. If you show them negative pictures, the amygdala of borderlines is significantly stronger activated. And what is also important, even when you show them neutral faces or neutral pictures, it's stronger activated. And this finding it's been replicated several times. This means it's an important thing. This means that borderline patients usually interpret neutral signals as dangerous and at least as relevant to keep attention on it. And this means they almost have never what we call a resting state situation. So when they say, okay, this is a neutral phase, it doesn't bother me, they always have to double check, does this change, is it important, is it not important? So all this automatized restless state doesn't work in borderline patients. And you see this for the left and the right amygdala. When it comes to connectivity, this was when we started those times, let's say 10 years ago, we were not able to calculate connectivity. Meanwhile, we can do it. So it means we can now study the interaction, the direct interaction between the frontal areas and the limbic systems. So we can look at the brakes. And what we see is that even beginning in the adolescence, the connectivity is underdeveloped. This means borderline patients have strong amygdala activation and they have lousy brakes. It's like, we tell them, it's like if you have a Porsche, yeah, and brakes of, what do you have in the States? A lousy car? A Ford, yeah? Not a Mustang, a Ford. I hope I'm right. Now do you understand the story? Thanks. So if you sum up the amygdala finding, first it's clear is we have reduced amygdala volume in borderline patients, we have an increased activation during emotional stimulation, and we have a reduced connectivity within these prefrontal areas. So it comes quite clear that this situation is due to an exaggerated amygdala activation. These normal people don't experience this. And what are the behavioral consequences? This is Marshall's statement, and we tested it and asked a huge amount of borderline patients simply for motives. Why do you cut yourself? Yeah, non-suicidal self-injury. And the answer, the overwhelming majority says, I do this for tension release for release of aversive tension, or to reduce unpleasant emotions. So those are exactly what Marshall predicted. Most dysfunctional behavior are strategies and consequences of this disorder of emotional regulation. So next step is we wanted to look, why do they cut themselves? And if you want to study cutting, you have to cut them. And I think our human subjects is even better than the Washington human subjects, and they allowed it us. And the cutting is not that harmful. I know it's the States, and whenever I present it to the States, I say, what are they doing? We exactly tested it. It's 1.75 times harder than a venous puncture. So it's tolerable. And we had to test it since the American journals wanted us to be clear that it's not really harming. The point is, we only included patients who were agreed, and patients who cut them anyway and said, okay, no, doesn't matter, and so on. So what we did is, here you see again this test here. This is our stress test. Healthies, borderline patients. This is the stress test. And then after we had them up on the level of arousal, then we assessed sham or a real small cut, and healthies don't like it. This. Borderlines like it. So they get simply an experimental induced decrease in their level of stress by cutting. I think that was not that surprising, but we did it in the scanner. And what we wanted to look is what happens with the amygdala. And what we found here is these are healthies, and if you cut them, you get an increase of amygdala. Of course, they don't like it. This is the borderline patients. And you see, this is the intercision, and you see a very, very strong decrease in the amygdala compared to the sham intercision here. Even that is a little bit better, yeah? But this is, I think, worldwide the first proof of concept that you see, okay, they cut themselves, and this is a really, really good working strategy to reduce your amygdala hyperreactivity. And it comes even better since we looked what happens? How does it work? And the point is that they increase their frontal-limbic connectivity. This is this slide. So you can say non-suicidal self-injury serves as a strategy to dampen amygdala hyperactivity by enhancing the dampened frontal-limbic connectivity. So this is like something like a self-help program. Yeah, and that's always the problem. This is the definition of a dysfunctional behavior. It's on the short way, it's working. On a long way, it's severely dysfunctional. Since, and what we don't know, is the neurochemistry mechanism. This is what we're going for now. There's some theory that it's opiates. The other theory is that it's prostaglandins, but we don't know. But you find something like a tachyphylaxia, which means you have to cut deeper and deeper and deeper, and you get addicted to that. And there are different mechanisms, and this is the next step we have to go. And what's important, we have investigated, now reinvestigate patients we have been treating 20 years ago and just reassemble them and ask them how was their life and what was their current problems, what helped them and so on. And almost everybody of them said, one of the things I'm suffering still is my scars. Since this hinders me in my partnerships, looking for new partners, this hinders me even go for swimming or for sport. This even hinders me sometimes to go in the kindergarten and things like that. So this is an important information, since if you are 19 or 20, you don't bother what happens with 40. But if you are 40, then you have troubles with your scars. So how does DBT target dysfunctional emotion regulation? First, and this is Marsha, we have to teach the patients that cutting or something like that is an automatic response pattern. And the point is they have to learn how to inhibit automatic response patterns. And this is by education, patients are monitoring, and you can put it on contingency management. Second, we teach patients how to observe and describe the current level of aversive arousal without reacting. This is reaction without reacting, and this is mindfulness. Here comes metacognitive awareness in the game, and you say, okay, I'm on a level of about 9, or saying, actually, I want to cut myself, however I have to do it, I do that different things. The fundamental training for this process, stepping out or getting over these activated cognitive emotional systems, is metacognitive awareness, and the training for metacognitive awareness is mindfulness. And of course, observing it is not enough. DBT offers skills to soften or to attenuate high levels of distress with distress tolerance skills. And the trick is, if you're really on a high level, you have to give them very strong sensory inputs. And the strong sensory input, I don't know exactly how that works, but it's tapers down this level of arousal. This can be smell of ammoniac, this can be ice cubes, this can be something else, even optical inputs or something. Strong sensory input coming from the outside helps. This is distress tolerance skills, as you can read in Marsha's book, and she invented the whole thing without any idea, I think. Maybe you was aware of that, but... And the next thing is, of course, you have to learn how to anticipate high levels of distress, and this is the whole field of emotion regulation skills. So since if it comes up to this high-end level, it's more or less too late. So you have to learn to anticipate and to start on a lower level and to work on your emotional regulation system. Data on that? Yes. Shelley McMahon just showed us data that pure skills training has a strong impact on emotional regulation here on the scales basis. We did the same in the fMRI. We tested the effect of DBT on emotional regulation in the amygdala system. And what we found here is quite interesting. So here this is, there are different tasks. We give them negative tasks, we give them neutrals, and we say just observe it or do something, yeah, use skills. This is healthy population. Usually you, oh gosh, here we are. Where's the mouse? Here's the mouse. This is the healthy population. This is the amygdala activation. You see usually if in neutral you don't have any activation, in negatives you have some sort of activation. This is just incidental. This is borderline patients. And now it comes, it's very important. We treated about 80, and then we looked for treatment responders and non-responders based on Sanarini's scale. This means on a general global scale. And we divided those two groups. The responder groups who really responded very well on DBT, they started with a high exaggerated amygdala level, and they learned how to taper them down. This is the level afterwards. It's almost on the level of the healthies. These are the non-responders. They don't show exaggerated amygdala activated at the beginning of the treatment, and they get worse. So obviously, this is a group which is different, even when they have the same diagnostic patterns. So, and this is something where I say, okay, on the one hand, it's working. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to work, so we can use fMRI for differential indication. And this is, of course, we have to do it, replicate it and so on, but it's at least a first glance that you can use this and think about whether it's the adequate treatment or not. The other thing is, it's, from my perspective, the very first time that you see that skills work on, really on the amygdala, on the brain. So we could use it for differential indication and also for monitoring therapy response. We want to go a step further, and the question is, could we ask patients to create their individual skills? The approach we did is real-time fMRI neurofeedback. This is what now is available. The game is the following. Here's our patient. Participant is in the scanner. The scanner is scanning. The calculation is calculation. And then you get a feedback signal in the scanner on the monitor. This means you see on the monitor your brain working in real time. And what we ask them is, this is an aversive picture, and this is this level on the side is the exaggeration of your amygdala. Recalculated in a frame. We don't show the amygdala, but we show this bars. And then we ask them, please try to lower this bar on this level here. And patients start to do that. So they do something. And what we can ask them afterwards is, what did you do that it works? And most of our patients we tested now said we use skills. However, we have native patients and ask them, what did you do? The first thing is we could show that it works. This is the fronto-limbic connectivity. What I told you is crucial. In the first training session, second, third, fourth training. So you need 2 training sessions, and it starts working. And it has an impact, meanwhile, also in more distal assessment on the scales and so on. So it seems to work that we can use it. And what we're going to now do is we take natives, non-DBT patients, and say, just try it and tell us what you did. And so we could double check whether there are some new possibilities, strategies, or something, how to taper down your amygdala. Maybe you have a huge variance. Maybe they do all the same, and we could bring this in the DBT community and say, okay, let's create skills out of that. So the summary, according to Marshall's model, emotion dysregulation has been proven to be a core feature of BPD. We have high reaction sensitivity, we have enhanced amplitudes and slow return to baseline. We have dysfunctional frontal limbic circuits. Skills seem to be appropriately target these neural mechanisms, and I think that these skills could be fine-tuned under experimental conditions. Next step. This was emotional regulation, and we want to have a short look on social interaction. Why? This is a test we give our patients. Just double check yourself, what do you feel looking at this picture? I think most of you feel, wow, it's nice. Hang out, youngsters. If you show these pictures to borderline patients, they feel enviness, bitterness, shame, anger, and so on. So they feel extremely discomfort. This is one of the major aversive challenges for our patients. And this is clear. this is due to social cognitions, which mean most of the patients would sign in is I'm strongly dependent of others. I hardly will survive being let alone. This is one thing. They are extremely pro-social. On the other hand, they have this deep feeling of being an outsider, being different than others. Others will reject me. I did not deserve being part of the group. I'm ugly, a lot of self-contempt and self-disgust. These are the core cognitions of those patients. And it takes no wonder, if you start to assess this, one of the most robust findings is rejection sensitivity. Marsha told us 20 years ago, there was no scale. Meanwhile, there is scales. And what you see, rejection sensitivity means the proneness of feeling rejected by others. And here you see this is the level of a control group. This is anxiety disorders, mood disorders. These are social phobics, where you usually think this would be the major problem of them. And here are the borderlines. This is outpatient borderline, inpatient borderline. So I would say, also from a clinical perspective, social rejection sensitivity is one of the core features of them. And this even persists in remission. We investigated acute and remitted borderline patients, and we found that even under stable remission conditions, when they don't meet any DSM-5 criteria any longer, they still feel lonely, and they still have problems with rejection sensitivity. And if it comes to loneliness, you see we provided what we call is a standard assessment of loneliness. This is the loneliness, UCLA loneliness scale. Here you see the average level of health. These are borderline patients. And here you see the distribution. So they're completely off the normal distribution. There's only an overlap of about 6%. And the core feature of loneliness in borderline patients is not being alone. It's being lonely within the groups. That's the pattern. So, and it doesn't help that much to say, okay, just join them. They are there, but then they feel, okay, they are overwhelmed by loneliness and feeling different within the group. That's the problem. Otherwise, it would be really easy. Testing it on so we started to do we set up a whole program and said, okay, let's go for the tiny little details of social cognition, and I show you only one or two examples. One of the most primitive computer games is Cyberball. You see here on the right one something like a figure, has a ball here, and here's a catcher, and here is the patient. It's a hand, yeah? Anyway, I found it crazy, but it works. And what you do, you can switch on between two modes, or three. You can say, A, please play together, and then the patients get every second ball here, or play alone, then they only play it. So it looks like this. This is the inclusion conditions, you see? This is the exclusion condition. And then we have a third modus where we say that tell the patient, there's nobody playing with you, it's only the computer. This looks like this. Yeah? That's a computer. You get every third ball. Rather boring. Patients play that. And after a while, when it's done, we ask them, did you feel ostracized, rejected during this game? And we have three conditions: inclusion, exclusion, and controls. And the amazing thing is, under exclusion conditions, borderline behave exactly the same as healthies. But when it comes to inclusion, they feel significantly more excluded. And even when it comes to control conditions, when they know that it's just a computer, they feel excluded. So the major problem is not a reaction on real exclusion. The major problem is feeling excluded during inclusion. This means not processing inclusion. And if it comes to fMRI, we looked at the fMRI, what happens during inclusion and exclusion. And what you see here is an important area near the insular region. Here is a healthy control that clearly differentiate between exclusion and inclusion, yeah, and the control condition. Borderlines don't notice that they are included. So the brain doesn't react on that. It's equal, it's the same. So now we start experiments with over-inclusion and look whether the brain is reacting if you give them, let's say, 90% of the balls, and then they say, okay, maybe I'm excluded. The problem is, if you have this pattern, which is just an experimental something, and you transfer it on the schoolyard. And then it happens, what I always say is this game. Imagine you have Honey and Nanny, two people sitting, chatting, and then our patient, Susie, comes. And Honey and Nanny are laughing and talking whether they should go to cinema or not. Susie comes and says, "What are you talking about?" And they say, "Oh, we talked about going to the cinema. Do you want to join us?" And Susie says, "Now that I'm asking you, you can't get the idea that you might invite me. That's nice, isn't it?" You understand? So she reacts as being rejected. And if you behave as being rejected, they say next time, should we really invite her? And then it is a vicious circle, and this is what happens. To get a little bit further, we developed a virtual reality group interaction paradigm. So this is, if you do science, you have to have standardized stuff. So this is a coworker of mine, and sitting here with a head-mounted display and looking at this beautiful surrounding. So this is an avatar, Lars, this is another avatar, Anna, and our patients are invited to meet these avatars. They are told the avatars are representatives of other real people. And then you have a design. First they introduce themselves, standardized. This is, I'm Anna, or I'm Susie. My hobbies are, my favorite dinner is, and if I would have a lot of money, I would do this and this. So they have to introduce them. Then they have to appraise the others. The question is, how sympathetic was Lars? Would you invite Nora for another meeting? If you would choose one of those who you want to really meet, who would it be? So that, clear? Then we put them in the scanner. And now we can experimentally manipulate between inclusion and exclusion. Let's say they get a picture and say, what do you think? How many people would have invited you? And then you give under inclusion condition, you get a picture like this. Okay. This? Yeah. And if you are excluded, you get this. So this is a post hoc information whether the group liked you or not. It's a very strong paradigm compared to this Cyberball stuff. And so, and next step is then we can afterwards we give them task. Let's say we check them on their own appraisal, and we ask them to play a social cooperation game. So we test the behavioral response to social inclusion or exclusion. What do we find? First, social expectation. First, the question first was, do you expect that people will invite you? Yeah? And you see, this is the baselines. Borderline patients significantly less expected that people would like them. Next step is, if you compare the discrepancy under exclusion conditions, you say, okay, we compare the first impression, then we tell them the group doesn't like you, of course, and then we ask, do you think what will be the next statements of the group? And what you see in healthies, they clearly differentiate whether they are excluded or not. Borderline patients show exactly the same pattern. This means if they are excluded or included, doesn't make any difference in the expectation whether they will be included next time. And the same thing is, would you like to invite others? Here, these are the healthies. Under inclusion conditions, they love them. They would invite the others. I'm fine. And under exclusion conditions, they are less. Borderline patients are exactly the same. So there's no memorizing that they had been and no learning that they had been invited. And if you then add what we call a trust game, this trust game means that you invest a little money. It triples if it goes to the trustee, and the trustee gives you a certain amount of money back. And so if you cooperate, you can both make a lot of money. If you don't cooperate, you lose both. Under exclusion conditions, this is the whole paradigm. Just listen. Under exclusion condition, there's no difference between borderline patients and healthies. under inpatient inclusion conditions, here you see, these are the healthiest, this is the amount of money they invest. And this is under inclusion conditions, and here borderline patients are extremely mistrusty and paranoid. This means they don't invest after inclusion. So the point is, after social inclusion in our virtual paradigm, patients act even less cooperative than under exclusion conditions. And the consequence is, if you assume to be treated as an outsider, if you interpret social cues as being an outsider, if you process positive social cues as irritating, if you behave like an outsider, you become an outsider. And how to treat loneliness and rejection hypersensitivity? We start now with a computerized training just to really train them up in memorizing positive aspects. And I think this is a major challenge what we have for DBT 2.0. And this is my lab. And this is the kowtow to Marsha. And thank you, Marsha, for sharing your passion and your wisdom.